Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Ostacher. I'm the digital content editor for Evidence-Based Mental Health. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion of a recent review from our journal, Digital Technologies for the Assessment of Cognition, a Clinical Review. We're joined today by the senior author of that paper, Ivan Koychev, who's clinical lecturer in old age psychiatry at the University of Oxford. He works on observational studies defining early disease biomarkers of dementia. We're also grateful to have with us John Torous from Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston and Harvard Medical School, where he's attending psychiatrist and on the faculty there. He leads their department's research and clinical efforts around digital psychiatry. We also are joined by Lisa Marzano, who's the editor for the digital section of Evidence-Based Mental Health. She's associate professor in psychology, specializing in health and suicide research methods. She's formerly a research fellow at Oxford. She's been at Middlesex since 2012. We're grateful to have her. I want to thank Veronica Heaney and Roxanne Kinajad for their background work setting up this talk. Ivan, why don't you set the stage for us with your paper, and this can lead into a discussion. We're also joined, as you can see, by Andrea Cipriani, who's the editor of Evidence-Based Mental Health and an associate professor of psychiatry at Oxford. Ivan, go ahead.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. So this was a clinical review that we decided to do as we're working on several projects that have to do with both digital monitoring of cognition, as well as we're using some wearable devices in these dementia studies that you mentioned. So I can always talk about these as well. But that was the thinking behind it. And the rationale for looking into digital technologies in dementia, to me, is quite strong. We know that dementia has a major economic burden, so on the level of society. So there's much to be gained by identifying risk factors for dementia, intervening at the right time, so before crises, and also putting in interventions to improve outcomes. The thinking is that through digital technologies, we can improve potentially the drug development by creating ecologically valid cognitive assessments, so cognition that is measured in people's own environments over protracted periods of time, which can lead to a very effective identification of people who are at risk. It can also lead to improved outcomes. So using digital technology to give feedback to people who are at risk on their modifiable risk factors, or providing cognitive training, because there is some evidence that people improve if they're getting if they're improving their cognitive stimulation. It's also scalable. So this is very important because, as we know, there's at least in the UK, the population is getting older, and one thing that happens when people get older is they move out of the big cities. So suddenly you have to deliver all this healthcare to people who live away from the major healthcare centers. So a scalable technology that is mobile it will be of use. It's also economically feasible. So this is technology that is widely available. Most people have it, so it's sitting there with its computational power. And lastly, it can lead to increased independence in people who have already, unfortunately, have dementia. We know that the reasons why people go into care have to do with just not managing with the daily activities. It's about safety. So we believe that digital technology has a role to play. So what we did is we performed a search of relevant items, and that was a difficulty in its own right, because, as you can imagine, it's a new area which is still developing, and the review probably wasn't exhaustive in that there's a number of ways that these technologies are defined in the literature. But in the end, we were able to focus on on cognitive apps. So anything that's smartphone based, that's either focusing on the detection of cognitive deficits or on cognitive assistance or cognitive training. Then we looked at smartwatches. And here, again, we looked at whether they're useful for detecting cognitive ability and also for assisting in daily life. And lastly, we looked at the field of smart homes and what they can offer. So in terms of the cognitive apps, there were a couple of examples of apps that have been developed to deal with that issue of whether we can assess cognition longitudinally in people's own homes. And they focused on the acceptability and the validity of the issues. And there was also some comparison against in-clinic testing. The issue here is that, of course, these are primarily pilot studies that were done by single groups. You know, for what it's worth, they reported, you know, that the technology was well tolerated and where a comparison was available against the gold standard. So very often a similar or the same test, but just in an in-clinic setting, they were claiming that it's very well that the results match very well. Then there was a cognitive assistance app that we found, which worked through providing people reminders. So this was targeted at people who were suffering from memory deficits. And again, it was testing the concept that you can remind people and you can increase their independence. Then there were a whole set of cognitive training apps. This is something that is of particular interest. And if you go on one of the Google Store and the App Store, you will find that there's a number of these apps which claim to improve your cognitive performance through repeated measures. So these were the articles that we found in the literature, which were trying to find the evidence for that. And you know, in the couple of studies, they did show that there is some improvement in working memory in people either with subjective cognitive impairment or with mild cognitive impairment. Again, you know, single studies, very much pilot results done by single labs. Then there are the smartwatches. The smartwatches offer a particularly interesting array of data in that they can collect, they can collect the location, they can have accelerometry, they can also record, you know, they have body sensors, so they can give you information on heart rate, temperature, and you know, they can also tell you about what the ambience is like. So some of them will have facilities to detect physical light. And one way that this can be done, and you know, some papers did that, is to model participants' behavior, especially directed to dementia, so that you can detect problem behaviors, so that people can intervene before it is a significant problem. Other ways in which they can be used is through their potential step counter mode, together with heart rate and location, so that in people who are unimpaired, they can give them a summary of their, for example, their physical activity, and they can give them prompts for, you know, to do more exercise, essentially to address modifiable risk factors. And they can also be used to infer cognitive status just by the activity, especially if you have longitudinal data. Finally, the other thing that we found was interesting was that there are some studies publishing on wearable cameras, which record data, which record essentially footage, and they record problem behaviors as well as interaction with carers, between dementia patients and carers, and then that can be used later on to analyze people's behavior. Finally, there's also a section on cognitive assistance here with wearables. One study was interesting in that it introduced the idea of smart glasses, where people would be, essentially dementia patients, would have, their carers would know their location by the GPS of the smart glasses, but also they would be able to see what the dementia people are seeing and then give them guidance on, for example, where to go if they need help with navigation. And there was also another study that looked at whether capturing photo shots with a, again, wearable camera every 30 seconds, then whether testing people's memories sometime afterwards, whether these tests would improve people's cognition. And moving on to the whole area of smart homes, which is, turns out it's a huge area. There's a lot of investment in that. So we've only managed to cover a proportion of all the work that's going on there. But the principles are that people place, essentially link together a number of different sensors, which could be bed mats, they could be magnetic contact sensors on the doors, they could be infrared motion sensors throughout the house, or it could be that they're linked to technology such as computers so that people can monitor the way that people interact with technology. And the way that this all comes together is that they use machine learning algorithms to teach, to essentially learn about the normal patterns of behavior for this particular person, particularly targeting dementia patients. And the goal is to detect dangerous events and dangerous activities, at which point they alert the carers. They also can be used to detect activities of daily living. And some of the studies show that there was at least they reported that they were able to detect certain activities with a high degree of certainty. And finally, a group that's in the US is looking particularly at the way that people use digital technology, as in PC, and they can show that you can predict people's cognition if you have enough longitudinal data of how they interact with their personal computer. Then you can detect potentially when there's a deterioration. So potentially useful in people who are at risk. And finally, we talked about, just in the discussion, we talked about the limitations of this technology. One obvious issue is the confidentiality, in that it implies constant monitoring. The second issue is about capacity. So a lot of the technology is applied to people who don't have the mental capacity to agree to that if they have dementia. Then there's a whole problem around the internet security and the fact that especially in a situation where a lot of devices in the house are linked together and are accessible by web, that makes them particularly vulnerable. And especially if the people are not particularly technologically minded, it may means that they're not keeping up with updates, which makes their environment even more vulnerable to attacks. And related to that, technology changes in that the different devices will go through different updates. So sometimes they may clash with whatever software you've developed, and suddenly the person who may not have the technological abilities is not able to operate a device, or has to seek additional help, which costs them money. So that's basically the extent of the paper. I'll be very happy to hear your thoughts on what you made of it.
All right. Well, Ivan, that's terrific. Let me remind people, if we're not speaking, it's helpful to be on mute so there's less feedback. For the audience, if you're watching live, please send us questions or comments through Twitter at #EBMHchat, and we'll try to collate those and address those as they come in. And if you're watching this on a recording, you're welcome to search that hashtag to see what discussion occurred on Twitter during our talk. John, do you have comments just off the top to start us off?
So I think it's a wonderful paper and topic, and I think it's kudos to you guys for writing it, and also to the journal for recognizing this is such an evolving topic that we need literature out. We as clinicians need to understand what's happening as researchers, know what's working. One thing that struck me in reading the paper was on the cognitive assistance for smartwatches, you guys noted that 0%, it says basically 100% success rate for completing tasks using functionalities, compared with 0% on navigation and emergency help tasks. So I guess that kind of brings up the question of, are people actually able to use these things? Or if we have 0% can use the help task on a smartwatch, do we have to almost take a step back and figure out, as you said, what are the risks in terms of safety, in terms of privacy, in terms of people's data? What is the benefit? Are we in the feasibility stage and the efficacy stage? So where kind of are we on that balance? And that kind of determines whether these things are ready for clinical use or not. So an open question in that kind of sense of where do we fit on the scale?
So yeah, I think that's a very relevant point. I don't think we know, essentially, and it may be that we need to do pilot testing for different groups. So it may be that for one group, they are actually able to interact with the technology so that it's safe, and we're able to. That balance is tipped towards benefit, in that people know exactly what they're doing. They're using the technology for their own benefit, but also they're providing useful information. But I completely agree with you. I think this particular piece of report there shows that for a subgroup, a whole facet of the interaction with technology is just not working, and it may also come down to the particular tech. As you know, even just changing from one device to the other, from a different phone, even if it's on the same operating system, the menus are different, and some people adapt to that and some people don't. So I think the bottom line is each technology has to be extensively tested exactly for this balance that you're talking about, John.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And sorry,
if I may, linked to this, I think one of the things that I think is interesting and possibly concerning sometimes is not just whether the individual user is ready to or is able to use the technology, but whether the sort of wider systems in which these technologies are kind of then funnel into are ready for these sorts of things. So I know there's this notion now of almost digital smoke alarms, and sort of in situations of risk, having sort of digital signals that alert a sort of crisis response in other contexts, but also potentially in this. And I wonder where you think we are in terms of having the broader system being able to cope with this and being willing and open to integrate digital innovations.
Again, I think this is super relevant because at the moment we're at the stage of data accumulation. Everybody's very excited about these technologies and are thinking of more and smarter ways to gather the data. But I agree with you. I don't think that at the moment we're at the stage where, for example, the healthcare system is in a state where it can make efficient use of the data. So we can easily end up in a situation where we're gathering data which potentially points to a very risky things happening, but we simply don't have an efficient way of dealing with the data, of analyzing the data at the right time, because this data will only be as useful as its timeliness. So I guess it's another point. So in addition to what we talked with John, in addition to sort of making sure that people can interact, this also has to go hand in hand with the healthcare systems that exist in that place, or the wider network, depending on what these alarms are targeting, to make sure that we're collecting data that we can act on.
And one thing that struck me in reading the paper too was you covered such a wonderful range of devices, from smartphones to smartwatches to smart homes. Each of them had some pretty exciting feasibility evidence. There was clearly something in each of them. But let's pretend I'm a young researcher, I'm a clinician, and I want to double down on one of them. And I want to say, what is the one thing that you're most excited about, that if I'm going to kind of invest research time, clinical time, funding time, you as the expert who wrote this paper, what would you say, John, go do this one, go 100%, it's going to be great. You can never say it's going to be, you can't go wrong, but you get the idea.
Right.
Well, I can speak from my own experience because, as I said, we're involved in some research. So And as usual, you know, when you have a lot of contextual information that you can say, you know, whether something is worth investing. So from my point of view, I think it's worth investing in developing of cognitive apps to detect cognitive impairment. So, for example, we're developing this app which allows cognitive testing. And the real value here is that you can test people, unlike in the clinic where you just have to test them on that occasion. With this app that we're developing, you can test over protracted periods of time. So you can retest them at 2 days, you can retest them at 4 days, 5 days, 7, 8, 9 days. And that's particularly relevant when you're thinking about the fact that the dementia field is moving towards prevention of dementia and trying to identify people who are 5 or 10 years before first symptoms. So these people would be at ceiling level, so they would be performing just as controls on the typical tests that we use in the clinic. But it's feasible. I think it's quite possible that if you use something that goes around these ceiling effects, so something that can, if you like, stress test people's memories over 5, 6, 7, 8 days, you can start to uncover deficits which otherwise you wouldn't be able to do. So I think from the point of view of what I find exciting, which is thinking about new treatments for dementia and finding the right groups to test these interventions on, I would say that developing these cognitive apps which go around the ceiling effects of typical cognition is the way to go. But equally, in my everyday clinical job, working with dementia patients, when I speak to my colleagues, they're very excited about anything that would help them to have an objective ways to assess activities of daily living. Yeah. And then if you talk to patients, they're really excited about anything that would give them independence, to patients or carers, anything that would give them a peace of mind. So I think it's a super exciting field. My personal interest is in these cognitive apps, but I can totally see the promise of these other two areas.
So say a little more about what you mean by stress testing people's cognition. So give an example of what that would be like, and what device you would use to do that, and how that would unfold.
Yeah, so in this particular case, we're relying on smartphones. So people have smartphones, so the technology is already there. So what we're using is we're developed this app essentially, in which people in the morning they learn to associate different items. So they go through a stack of these things. So they learn a number of different pairs, and it's a difficult task. But it's the sort of task that you can scale. So if you find that people are struggling, then the task cuts off and it just deals with the items that it knows that the people remembered. And if they're doing better, then it lets them remember more. It lets them remember more pairs. But the critical issue is that the testing, then you can really play around with the testing and retest people a day later, or retest it at 3 or 5 or 7 or 9 days later. And when it becomes really exciting is when you add an element of adaptability to the task, in that if you have enough data for these people, you start to realize that at what point are they starting to lose 50% of what they remembered at the point when they learned. And the next tests that you do are clustered around this time point that you start to realize this is where they lose 50%. So you get a sort of a very highly precise estimate of their subclinical cognitive performance.
Are you saying this is probably going to work best for within-person comparisons? Of course, the opposite being, is this going to be a population measure? You take the test in clinic or use the app for a week, and we say, compared to people in your cohort, you are this, or do we say you are your own baseline and we are finding within-person changes, which are very different use cases, equally important, but it sounds like you're leaning more towards one.
Yeah, we're definitely heading towards creating inter-individual trajectories that we're thinking are particularly useful in at-risk populations. So we're deploying it in a clinical studies register of people who are willing to be contacted about research. We know that they're at risk, so we're trying to gather a lot of, what's called run-in data. So a very, very high density cognitive assessments on these people, so we can create their trajectories, where we expect them to be in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years, so that if they go into a clinical trial, then the power of detecting a positive change for that particular individual becomes ever so powerful.
That makes sense.
Lisa, do you have a thought? Oh, you have to unmute. Yeah. You can leave it off for the rest of the Hangout.
One of the things I was wondering, I mean, I know this applies to so many areas in sort of digital mental health, is that, of course, if a patient or actually a clinician or carer goes on the App Store or Android store and they type in, sort of any apps for dementia or cognition or anything like that, they retrieve hundreds, probably thousands of apps.
Right.
And where are we in sort of trying to decide, in being able to help guide the process of selecting the right one, in inverted commas? And I wondered what, working in this field, both as a researcher and a clinician, whether you have any thoughts on what those quality criteria, if you want, might be.
I think it's, go on.
Okay. So last year, actually, we downloaded a bunch of apps for dementia off the iTunes store.
Right.
But what we did is we read the privacy policies. We didn't actually look at what they did. We just read the privacy policies. It's this huge stack of paper. And we kind of tried to pull out when you're using an app for dementia that's publicly available, what are you giving up? What research data what data are you giving up? And what we found was a certain percentage of apps promised not to sell your data. And that percentage of apps that agreed not to sell your data was 4%. So 96% of them either assured you they would sell your data for profit or were very vague about it. So only 4% said, when you give us personal information, be it symptoms, be it a GPS ping, something personal that could be identifiable, only 4% are going to protect your information. And that's not a good foundation for this. Again, those are commercially available apps. A lot of those things have zero research backing. In some ways, all of us listening could put up apps on the store that says we work for dementia too. No one is actually doing a clinical quality or evidence-based review of what is an app for dementia, but certainly a little bit frightening that you have a 96% chance of your data being sold if you download one of these dementia apps. And needless to say, someone with dementia may not be able to go through a 13-page privacy policy, depending on...
you think so?
Sometimes I may not be able to go through a 13-page privacy policy.
Exactly.
So I think it does kind of frame the issue Laura brought up, in that we do need some way to help people make more informed decisions right now, here and today, because you want people to have good experience of apps today, so when we build better things tomorrow, they're receptive to them. You don't want people to have such horrible experiences in 2017, 18, that by the time we have these great apps out in 2019, people go, oh my God, that was the thing that stole all my data and was completely useless. And now they want me to do it again. I'm not foolish. I'm going to ignore it. So it's a hard problem. I don't have a solution. With the American Psychiatric Association, we've worked on an app evaluation framework. It's a very early stage framework. We don't pick any apps. We don't tell you one is good or bad. Just like I can't tell you what treatment is good or bad for you, what medication is good or bad. But what we ask people to do on the website, we basically say, think about first the privacy and security. Next, think about the evidence, if there's any or not. Third, think about the usability. Make sure it's something you can stick with. And fourth, think about data interoperability. By data interoperability, I mean, can the data get back to your clinical team, to your family members, the people you want to be supporting you? So what is the safety? What is the efficacy? What is the usability? And what is the kind of data interoperability? But again, those are very broad categories, but we think even thinking about those may help weed out a lot of apps.
And it's interesting that you list them in that order, because often I think the sort of research, the kind of feasibility studies follow a different order. They focus on the usability first. They do, you know, the kind of, are people engaging with them? Are they using them? And I think much of the evidence you reviewed was, you know, sort of relatively small pilot study, often with sort of healthy individuals involved. But they don't, often we don't go as far as thinking about the privacy. Maybe there's some discussion in the literature about interoperability, but the privacy question is an important one, and I think people need a bit more guidance on it. Absolutely agree.
Yeah, I mean, we did a hangout last November looking at assessing health apps for chronic insomnia, right? Which is a very you know, it's a common problem. You don't have to have a diagnosis to use it. People want to sleep better, and so they evaluated the apps using this Orca 24 framework, and found similarly, not quite as bad as what you found, John, but found similarly that not every app had a privacy policy, and it came with one, and the ones that did, not, you know, a smaller proportion. About a third of the apps that had a privacy policy explicitly stated that they wouldn't share your data, but the other ones did not. And so I think privacy is probably first and foremost the major barrier, I think, to people feeling like the use of these products will be safe for them, aside from whether or not they can be hacked into, right? In other words, just the companies that are using that are overseeing the apps and the devices are collecting data. Just focusing on that, it's a major issue, and certainly I assume in the UK and across the world, but certainly in the United States, issues with privacy and social media in general have become a huge problem, and you can't practically turn the television on here without getting an apology advertisement from Facebook about their past behavior and how they promise that they'll be better in the future. I know that they're lying.
And it's, yeah.
You were cut off.
Facebook cut you off.
That's it. The power of Facebook.
But it's worth remembering too, the Cambridge Analytical thing started with a psychology test, right? It was actually a mental health related thing. It said, do you want to take this personality test online? So it actually was kind of through the mental health field that this whole thing actually began, because people are curious about their mental health, their personality profile. They want to do stuff online that's accessible. And that was the beginning of Cambridge Analytica. It said, learn about your personality, and click. And thus we got to today.
Yeah, I have a slightly related question, starting also from what's reported in the paper. At some point, Ivan, there's a statement. I read it so we can think about the timely adoption of such technology in clinical practice is a challenge that requires effective communication between developers and clinicians about the availability of such solutions. And my point is exactly about the communication between clinicians and developers, and also how do you involve clinicians and possibly patient and public into this development? Because the risk of having a vested interest in technology is everywhere. So I'd like to know what you think.
Yeah, again, I think that's a very relevant point. I find that people are coming from very different points of the discussion when, you know, a new product is developed between a healthcare professional and a developer. And you know, it's just different mindsets, and I think we just need to learn to talk and to communicate, because if you just do it every now and then you find that it can be difficult to complete, just because of the different mindsets. For example, developers, the way that they think about technology is something that's continuously evolving. While for us as scientists or clinicians, you want something that's more or less fixed so that you can assess its efficacy. While, you know, if you go with a developer model of something that's continuously changing, then it's very difficult to actually say anything about the way that it, you know, just draw any conclusions about its usability. That's one of the challenges that I found, and I think that extends. So I don't have a good enough answer of how we can improve the communication, but it may be that simply because it's an area of such interest and so much is, you know, just like with that example that you gave about how many apps there are on the store, it's just a snowball. So there's so much investment in this that at some point I think just the market is going to look for apps which involve healthcare professionals and involve the healthcare system that you're familiar with. So an app that is backed by, for example, the NHS will carry a lot of weight, and that will just force us to communicate. But I don't know, Andrea, maybe you have a better solution. You've worked on apps as well.
No, I think the worry is to think that the newer is the better in terms of, yes, how smart is the device or how cutting edge is the technology. And I always realize how we should be based on the ground when I consider the priority I may have as a clinician compared to the priorities of the patients. For instance, in terms of side effects, we think we know about how they think or our colleagues think, and the communication is a key issue. And I'm also thinking, as researchers, can we develop new study design? Can you find new ways to communicate and engage in the discussion, clinicians and patients? Because otherwise the unidirectional thing may be harmful, I think, in the long run.
I think that's a good point, Andrea. And my background before medical school is computer science, and I think anyone who's coded certainly knows that code is never perfect. Rollouts of any healthcare intervention or thing, everything has some side effects, no matter how benign it seems. So I think this does warrant a very cautious approach as we move forward, because there will be unintended consequences, and it's hard to foresee exactly what those will be. I think we're all excited by the potential. That's the reason that the whole field is moving in this direction, is we see what a wonderful opportunity this technology gives us. But I do like your point of saying we have to be very, very careful, because new data is good, but at what cost? And if we don't understand those costs yet, we certainly, at least the mantra we have is don't do harm is the #1 mantra, and it's unclear what harm is in this case.
I wonder if there are some risks around, can you hear me, Sam? Around social isolation, and whether sort of paradoxically interventions, you know, you mentioned earlier, Ivan, about, you know, people moving to sort of more rural locations and how much more difficult it becomes to access healthcare in those circumstances, and whether if we don't have a sort of appropriately blended systems, if you want, so systems where the technology is actually interacting with clinicians and real people, we risk that these technologies might reinforce social isolation rather than reduce it.
I think this is a well-recognized risk, is that people sort of get very comfortable with technology to the exclusion of social contact, and that in a way goes back to the costs of what it means, especially in the healthcare setting, to implement new costs. Everybody's excited about these technologies, but you know, they'll have to take, you know, some money, some time of a clinician's time will have to go into interacting these technologies, which may otherwise have been spent interacting with people. And so the same goes for patients. But I think particularly for dementia, it may actually work out the opposite way, in that in my everyday practice, I see a lot of older people who unfortunately, are just, you know, alone at home, and they have minimal interactions. And there are these initiatives which are using digital technologies to get these older people to talk to each other and to socialize, you know, using digital technologies in a way that just wouldn't be possible because they're of limited mobility. They don't really have the resources anywhere locally to go and meet people. So again, it's something to be aware of. But I think particularly around social isolation of the elderly, I think as, you know, the elderly population becomes more technologically literate, I think that is again a very fruitful area.
And I think that's in some ways that solves two problems with one, because engagement is always a trick with these devices. And you can almost think of engagement of, you can give people data back and say, here's a graph of your various symptoms. You can gamify it and kind of make it a game, or you can kind of have a social component to it. And I think the evidence has shown, if you really want to drive engagement, having a social component to these technologies, these apps, really is probably, at least as of June 2018, seems to be winning in the evidence space. So in some ways, if you can get the social component to drive engagement, but also reduce isolation, you kind of have a nice win on both fronts, which is always great.
Lisa, you were about to say something.
No, I was wondering, I guess picking up on that point and about engagement, what your, you know, what the evidence is, but also what your experiences are as a clinician of how people do engage with these technologies. And I guess maybe we're talking about people who are affected by dementia, but also their carers. And of course, there's the clinical sides and how colleagues might feel about integrating these technologies in their practice.
Yeah, maybe others want to comment on this, but from my experience, I think the early adopters of technology tend to be the carers. They're the people who tend to be more technologically able, and they're the people who are really looking for solutions to very immediate problems. You know, they're looking after somebody who's at risk of wandering, or they're looking after somebody who's, you know, prone to leaving the hob on or flooding the place. They're adamant that they want to live independently. They don't want to go into a care home. But every day it's a groundhog situation where, you know, and you can't really blame them because it's just that, you know, due to the impairment. So it's the carers who reach out to the variety of technologies. And again, you know, we're talking mostly about wearables here. There are these websites which offer products. And the critical thing is that it should be something that is more or less passive. So it assumes that, you know, the people with dementia will have very low active engagement with that product. But it's something like, you know, GPS trackers in the soles, or it's just sensors that are put around appliances and so on. So I think the engagement is very good from the carers, but it's a well-recognized issue with people with dementia. And then once you move into the at-risk groups, I think the engagement will depend either A, on what John was talking about, on the social side, is there a social side to this interaction, or B, on the transactional nature, as in, are they getting anything out of it? And very often with these apps, the transaction is some sort of feedback on how they are. But whether that can sustain people's interest for sufficiently long, I'm very cautious about that. From my own experience, I download things, I use them for a while, and then they go into a page where I discover them when I'm particularly bored. But, you know, generally they go back.
It's not an advertisement, but I love my Google Watch. I mean, my Apple Watch rather, but it's a big problem because I have to charge it, and I have to, you know, it's finicky, and you know, I'm involved in digital technologies, but I'm not a kid, so. But I mean, we're talking about dementia. You getting people just to wear their devices and keep them charged and keep them connected and make sure that they're in an environment where they can stay connected and that the device is updated seems an enormous challenge. And yet the opportunities for these devices to improve independence and to decrease loneliness, I think, seems very high. And so how do you think that those barriers might be dealt with going forward? Because they seem, we're early adopters. That's why we're on the call, right? Right. That's why we're on this Hangout, right? So I assume that the barriers for a typical elderly person with cognitive impairment for using a device effectively and maximally are going to be high. So do you have thoughts about how that might look going forward?
So yeah, I think it will be a challenge. All of these, maintaining engagement and making sure that people make use of these devices. The one thing that I've come across, which may offer a solution, but it comes with its own, with its own bag of very serious considerations, is that the fact that the technology for implants is progressing, and now that there are these essentially devices which could be implanted. They don't need to be charged, and they're tolerated. And I can see how at some point people, when they realize that there's a great potential but the engagement is low, they'll start thinking about the possibility of using something that's inobtrusive. But there's an obvious limitation to that. In that essentially you're using some ways of tracking people who don't have the capacity to agree with that. But I'm sure the debate will come when the time will come when that will be a point of debate. I don't know whether somebody has a better answer to that question.
I don't think anyone does. There's an interesting online forum called CORE, Connected Open Research Ethics, run by Camille Nebaker at UCSD. That's been a nice forum, at least, to post these issues, have a discussion board, talk about IRB ethical considerations. And it has a lot of researchers just kind of posing questions and in some ways trying to crowdsource or learn how do you do this in the right way, because no one really knows, as you said, it's so new.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking more the technological barrier.
That too.
Right. I mean, I think that the ethical barriers and the privacy issues are enormous, and we're only beginning to understand the extent to which private has been given up for the sake of convenience or getting something for nothing. But I think that what do you think the device barriers are? Because I mean, I think if there's a psychiatric problem that could be monitored or helped by digital technology, this has to, dementia and aging and cognitive impairment has to be the one with the broadest opportunity for being helped. No,
I agree. I think one of the device barriers is every device actually has often a different sensor set in it. My smartphone has a different accelerometer perhaps than your smartphone has. My smartphone may have a different operating system, different battery life. So when you're asking this phone for at least passive sensor data, these are not precision medicine instruments. They're consumer devices that give a lot of great data, but there's a lot of heterogeneity in the data that you collect. When you're collecting something like, say, step count from a watch or a phone, if you take a step back and say, what is a step is clearly defined as a function of an accelerometer and when it gets it, but what if we can't compare steps? Or what if Apple or Google changes the algorithm for a step count? Now all our research from the first half of subjects may be different, the steps are different. So one of the barriers of devices themselves don't lend themselves to reproducible raw data very easily, perhaps at the level of resolution that we would want as clinical researchers and that patients would want to know that what we're telling them actually works and is reproducible. So in some ways, the devices will keep getting better, but we need to make sure that they give us the data that we think. And again, what the heck is a step and who's defining it for us?
Yeah. And on a related point, we know that the data that you actually can extract from these devices is very much dependent on the algorithms that sit behind it. So, and there will be a lot of, I think that will be the real difficulties if you want to go and say, well, we really want to look at how you derive this variable, and then you run into intellectual property issues, which may mean that you're just left with, as you were saying, these outcome measures, which you don't know how well they compare to each other. I think that's super relevant. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I was thinking the same thing actually about all these sort of machine learning algorithms and not really knowing. I think computer scientists call them sort of black box machine learning versus white box machine learning, which is about as technical as I will get. But the point is that we don't really know how they model our behavior, and when very important, potentially important decisions or kind of trigger alerts, whatever, are based on algorithms that we don't understand, and sometimes for intellectual property issues are not able to understand, I think that's quite problematic. And I think it would be great if it could all be more transparent.
I think there's beginning to be more of a move towards open source software in this field. For those of you on the webcast, open source software is kind of software that no one owns. The code is there publicly. Anyone can take it and use it themselves, make a business, adapt it, change it. And because I think as software development gets cheaper, code becomes easier, these kind of become plug and play modules in machine learning. We'll have more open source tools. And I think that's exciting for the research community because we can all work on the same tools. A lot of the collaborations I do around smartphones and mental health are with the Harvard School of Public Health and J.P. O'Nella's group, because they've built an open source tool for smartphone research called BWI, where anyone can use it for free. There's no intellectual property. And it's nice because we actually can write a paper and say, here's the app we used, you can use it for free. Here's a configuration file of all the settings we used. You can do our settings, and you can now go. We think that's where science and progress happens. The people saying, John, you guys thought you had this, but actually it's different. And you can't do that until you have tools that are kind of open like that.
And linked perhaps to this point about research and the sort of research community, I wonder, because we've talked mostly about the clinical applications and the potential in this in a sort of in that context and in terms of treatment and monitoring. But what do you think about the kind of the more the applications in terms of research and understanding trajectories of dementia, and to what extent are these data being used purely for research purposes?
I think there's a lot of interest in this, and the app that I mentioned that we're developing, it's done in collaboration with industry, who are already plugging it into clinical trials, and so I think that the potential is there, as long as you have essentially access to what we talked about, to underlying algorithms, because your research, you won't be able to do research if you're just dealing with outcome measures that you don't know how they were derived. I don't think that would work. But if you're able to deal with something that's open source, then there's a huge potential, especially once healthcare cohorts move into the digital side. So a lot of cohorts, were limited in the past by the fact that people had to come in and do these measurements and do these epidemiological, studies, which required a lot of manpower. But now that everybody has access to the internet, cohorts are becoming more expansive in collecting data through digital means. There's a number of these initiatives. Say, for example, in the US, there's the Brain Health Registry, which is entirely web-based, and the cognitive assessments are done online. and people answer questions, and then people come back every 6 months, and then it becomes a platform for clinical trials, and a clinical trial that recruits can actually go into the history of these people and look at their individual trajectories and select for those that are most likely to be in preclinical stages of the disease. And I can have just that in its own right, just having a higher chance that those that you're bringing in for screening for clinical trials, having a higher chance that they're in preclinical disease as opposed to being normal, not having the biomarkers for dementia, it's already associated with such savings that it's making developments of compounds possible where otherwise they would have been abandoned because it's too expensive. And that's just a very simple way in which these digital technologies are applied today. But if your data is good enough, if you have access to the underlying algorithms, I think there's a lot to be said for the use of these technologies for research. I don't know whether anyone else has experience with this.
No, I was wondering, Ivan, whether this is a world where researchers collaborate, large partnership, or is it more individual, local, competing one versus the other?
I hope that with digital technology, we're moving towards the second, and especially with the open access codes and so on. I think that most people that are at least the people that I collaborate with, they publish their code open source. I think that's pushing in that direction. And together with now the funders, as you know, they expect data that's collected through grants of that funder. They expect the data to be made openly available because very often it's public money, and it's only logical that if this is the new normal, then you would expect people to become ever so integrated with each other and less insular.
But is it fair to say that perhaps there's less competition, within the research or clinical community, because the big competitor is the private sector, and I wonder whether you feel that's an issue or not, because of course in terms of being able to sort of push new products out and perhaps sort of market them, etc., academics, clinicians are at a disadvantage. And whether there's a risk that we might sort of be pushed out of working, researching, applying these technologies if we're not able to move quickly enough for the field. Our RCTs will tell us if something works or not at a point where it's probably obsolete in technological terms.
I think that's a valid concern. And speaking to people who are developing software at academia, their concern is that simply academia doesn't offer the same financial incentives to work there to its employers. So the people who are really good at coding will tend to go and work for the industry simply because they get paid a lot more. So you can see how a project that's running from an academic center probably will lag behind, but I expect this to be true for applications where there's very immediate gain to be made, as in there's a clear marketing potential. But I still think that it's on the basis of this rapid development, we can all see how we can apply this technology in other fields, and we can still be competitive.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't just thinking about brain power, if you want, but just our timings are different. If we want to get funding to start a new project, we know how long that takes. A couple of rejections sometimes thrown in the mix.
Yeah, exactly.
Then ethical approval, etc., etc. So I think it's difficult then to compete. Maybe
I guess the question is whether we need to compete or whether we can come up with join forces, as it were, because at some point, there are obvious limitations to just working from industry, in that you may just keep doing producing these apps, but if they don't have a good research evidence, or if they don't have they're not developed with healthcare professionals, it turns out that it's a lot of wasted time. And so at some point, as I think the process matures, I think will be, academics and healthcare professionals will be sought out so that, the product that comes out it's the best it can be.
I think that's a terrific comment to end the discussion, Ivan. I think that's exactly the point, and we'll have to see how this partnership between academia and industry sort of falls out at the end. We are out of time for this Hangout. I wanted to appreciate your presenting your terrific paper. I want to also thank John Torous, whose comments added a terrific amount to this discussion. He's at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center at Harvard Medical School, and to Lisa Marzano at Middlesex University, along with Andrea, Cipriani. I'm Michael Ostacher. I want to thank you all for joining us. Please follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Follow our comments at hashtag EBMHchat. Hashtag EBMHchat. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.